You would not have survived the Victorian era, and now you will find out why. But behind the facade of elegant mansions and smoking factory chimneys lay a different reality, especially at the bottom of the plate. Food was not just a means of sustenance, but a mirror reflecting the gulf between wealth and despair. This is not a story of lavish feasts, but of a quiet daily struggle for survival, where resourcefulness became the main ingredient. People ate what we would not consider edible today, and ordinary foods were turned into deadly counterfeits. Women, the guardians of the hearth, carried an unimaginable burden of responsibility on their shoulders, managing a budget that was barely enough for bread. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary tea could contain more poison than tea leaves, and why buying a loaf of bread turned into a real game of Russian roulette. I will reveal the best-kept secret of Victorian chefs. While high society enjoyed exquisite dishes with dozens of courses, the poor only saw meat on major holidays. The gap between the diet of the rich and the diet of the poor was so huge that it seemed as if they lived in different worlds. For the aristocracy, the table was a stage where status and wealth were displayed. Expensive meats, exotic fruits brought from the colonies, and elaborate desserts that required hours of work by a whole team of chefs were served. A typical lunch might consist of soup, fish, several types of roasted meat, game, puddings, and pies. At the other end of the spectrum were millions of people for whom bread and tea were the height of gastronomic diversity. Their diet was meager and monotonous, consisting mainly of the cheapest foods. Meat was a luxury, and fresh vegetables and fruits were a seasonal and rare treat. One of the most iconic dishes of the era, illustrating this difference, was turtle soup. It was an incredibly expensive and prestigious dish that only the wealthiest could afford. It was made from real green sea turtles, which were delivered from far away. But the ingenuity of chefs serving a less affluent clientele gave rise to mock soup or mock turtle. Instead of expensive turtle, they used calf byproducts, brains, hooves, and cartilage. These were boiled for a long time to achieve the desired consistency, reminiscent of turtle meat. This dish became a symbol of the era, the desire to imitate luxury without having the means to afford it. It was served in middle-class homes that wanted to appear richer than they actually were. This created the illusion of wealth on a plate. In essence, it was a culinary fake, a deception that everyone tacitly accepted. The taste was completely different, but the name allowed them to touch the world of the aristocracy. And there were many such mockers in Victorian cuisine. For the poor, even such a soup was an unattainable dream. Their lot was soups made from potato peelings and bones, which could be bought for pennies. This culinary gap divided society more reliably than any class barriers. At the same time, it was the woman's responsibility to cook something edible from these meager ingredients. She had to show miracles of ingenuity to feed her family with only water, flour, and a few vegetables at her disposal. Her role in this theater of survival was key, but completely invisible. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this desire to imitate luxury even in food? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about the main food on every Victorian's table? Bread was the absolute staple of the diet for the vast majority of the population. It was cheap, filling, and accessible, accounting for up to 70% of all food consumed by working-class families. In the morning, at lunch, and in the evening, bread was present at every meal. It was eaten with a small amount of cheese, washed down with weak tea, or simply dipped in gravy, if there was any. The quality and composition of this bread directly affected the health of the nation. However, it was this basic product that became the field for the most widespread and dangerous counterfeiting. Bakers, seeking to reduce costs and increase profits, resorted to unimaginable tricks. This turned buying bread into a daily risk. The most common method of counterfeiting was to add alum to the flour. This chemical compound made the bread snow white, even if the flour was of poor quality, gray, and dirty. White bread was associated with prosperity, and buyers eagerly purchased this improved product. In addition, alum allowed the flour to absorb much more water. This increased the weight of the loaf, and the baker could sell water at the price of bread. Visually, such bread looked fluffy and large, but in reality, it was less nutritious. But alum was not the only additive. Potato flour, beans, peas, and even sawdust were mixed into the flour to increase its volume. All this significantly reduced the nutritional value of the product, which was the only source of calories for many people. Sometimes more dangerous substances were used. Chalk or lime could be added to the flour to make it whiter. Such additives not only had no nutritional value, but could also be harmful to health. Women who went to the market on a limited budget found themselves in a difficult situation. They had to choose bread for their families, but could not be sure of its quality. Their choice determined whether their loved ones would receive any nutrients at all. This deception was so widespread that the government had to intervene. In 1860, the first law on food adulteration was passed, but it was ineffective. The fight against counterfeiting in the kitchen continued for decades. Why do you think the simplest and most important foodstuff became the target of such widespread counterfeiting? But bread was just the tip of the iceberg. In the next chapter, you will learn how Victorians learned to counterfeit absolutely everything, from milk to candy, and what shocking ingredients they used to do so. What I am about to show you was prohibited by law, but it happened in every kitchen. The era of industrialization gave rise not only to new technologies, but also to an unprecedented boom in food fraud. Absolutely everything was counterfeited, often using chemicals that were extremely hazardous to health, the dangers of which few people were aware of at the time. Milk, which was an important product, especially in cities, was often diluted with water. To hide its bluish tint and restore its rich appearance, chalk was added to it, and sometimes even sheep's brains ground into an emulsion. This was a standard practice among milkmen at the time. Butter was also subject to counterfeiting. It was mixed with cheaper lard or beef fat. To give the mixture a yellow color, dyes such as annatto or even lead chromate, which is a toxic substance, were used. Tea, which had become the national drink, was counterfeited on a particularly large scale. Used tea leaves were bought up from hotels and restaurants, dried, colored with graphite or iron oxide, and resold as fresh tea. It was a huge underground business. Expensive teas were mixed with dried leaves from other plants, such as blackthorn or elderberry. To imitate the color and tartness, this mixture was treated with chemicals. The buyer paid for an elite drink, but received colored and flavored garbage. Even the sweets that Victorians loved so much were fraught with danger. Brightly colored lollipops and candies were dyed with toxic dyes based on lead, copper, and arsenic. Red was obtained from mercury sulfide and green from copper acetate. Cheese was often colored with cinnabar or red lead to give it an appetizing orange hue. Strychnine was added to beer for bitterness, and copper salts were added to pickled cucumbers to preserve their bright green color. The list of these tricks was endless. The entire food industry, unregulated by the state, was built on consumer deception. Manufacturers sought to maximize profits by any means necessary. Consumers, lacking knowledge of chemistry, were unable to recognize the fakes. It was a veritable chemical war waged in the kitchens and stomachs of ordinary people. Women, as the main purchasers of food, were on the front lines of this war. They intuitively tried to choose quality products, but often lost in this unequal struggle. The fight against counterfeiting became one of the first public movements for consumer rights. Scientists such as Arthur Hill Hassall conducted microscopic analyses of products and published shocking results. It was their work that laid the foundation for modern food quality control. What if I showed you Victorian fast food? As cities and factories grew, the pace of life changed. Many workers did not have the time or opportunity to eat a proper lunch at home. This led to the rapid development of street food, which became a lifeline for millions of city dwellers. The streets of London, Manchester, and other industrial centers were filled with vendors' stalls and carts. They offered hot and cheap food that could be eaten on the go. The assortment was surprisingly diverse, albeit specific. One of the most popular dishes was meat pies. They were sold hot and were a filling and convenient lunch. However, the question of the origin of the filling always remained open, giving rise to dark urban legends. Another hit was oysters. Today they are considered a delicacy, but in Victorian England they were food for the poor. There were so many of them that they cost less than meat and were sold right on the streets, with the shells opened in front of the buyer. Vendors sold hot pea soup, fried potatoes, and baked apples. You could buy a glass of ginger beer or lemonade. Street food was an integral part of the urban landscape and culture. However, the quality and hygiene of this food left much to be desired. The products were often not fresh, and they were prepared and sold in completely unsanitary conditions. Of course, the vendors had no running water or sewage systems. Buying food on the street was always a gamble. You could get a hearty and tasty meal, or you could get seriously ill. But for many workers, it was the only way to get a hot meal during a long working day. Street vending was one of the few ways women could earn a living. Many widows or wives of unemployed men could only survive by selling homemade pies or soup on the street. It was their small business that allowed them to feed their families. This street food culture became the precursor to modern fast food. It responded to the main demand of industrial society: quick and high-calorie food for those who did not have time. The principles established then still work in this industry today. But what about beverages, which were just as important as food? In the next chapter, you will learn how ordinary water became a problem and how new colonial beverages changed British society forever. Ready to learn more? Behind every meal, whether it was a meager soup or a festive pie, there was a woman. She was the financial director, nutritionist, and chef of her family. Her task was to turn the meager budget allocated to her by her husband into food for the whole week. Housekeeping was the only area where a woman could demonstrate her managerial talents. However, her power was limited by the strict framework of patriarchal society. All the money belonged to her husband, and he gave her an amount for housekeeping at his discretion. This amount was often insufficient. Women had to be incredibly resourceful to stretch a few shillings for food, coal, and candles. They had to economize on everything to make ends meet. Going to the market was a real battle. Women had to visit several merchants, compare prices, haggle, and at the same time be able to distinguish a product of at least some quality from a blatant fake. All their experience and intuition were thrown into this task. Many dishes of Victorian cuisine for the poor were born out of this need to save money. Bone soups, stale bread, puddings, stews made from the cheapest offal. All this was the result of women's ingenuity. She couldn't afford to throw away a single crumb. In the mid-19th century, cookbooks aimed at middle-class women began to appear. The most famous was Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management. It contained not only recipes, but also advice on managing servants and planning a budget. This book became a veritable Bible for housewives. It raised the prestige of housekeeping, presenting it as a complex and important profession. However, for working-class women, its advice was of little use due to the high cost of ingredients. The life of a woman from a poor family was subject to an endless cycle of cooking and saving. She got up before everyone else to light the stove and went to bed after everyone else, having finished her household chores. Her work was hard but completely invisible and unappreciated by society. The responsibility for the health of the family fell on her shoulders. If the food was bad and someone got sick, it was the housewife who was blamed, not the food adulterators or poverty. She was under constant stress, trying to fulfill her duty in impossible conditions. Thus, the history of food in the Victorian era is primarily a history of women's labor and ingenuity. It is a story of millions of nameless heroines who performed daily feats at their stoves simply so that their families could survive. What if I told you that everything you believed about British tea drinking was untrue? Today, tea seems like a quintessentially British drink, but it was during the Victorian era that it became widely popular. It radically changed the country's diet, way of life, and even its economy. Initially, tea was an expensive drink, available only to the aristocracy, but lower tariffs and expanded trade relations with China and India made it accessible to all classes of society. By the middle of the century, absolutely everyone drank tea, from the queen to the beggar. For the working class, tea became a real salvation. The hot, sweet, and slightly invigorating drink provided energy for hard work in the factory. It often replaced a full meal, as it was cheaper and easier to prepare. Sugar also became part of the diet along with tea. Huge sugarcane plantations in the colonies provided cheap supplies. Tea with sugar became a source of quick calories, although it was practically devoid of nutrients. The spread of tea gave rise to the famous tradition of 5 o'clock tea. This tradition originated in aristocratic circles as a light snack between lunch and dinner. Over time, it spread to the middle class, becoming an important social ritual. Tea drinking became the responsibility of women. It was they who brewed the tea, set the table, and maintained polite conversation. It was one of the few forms of leisure available to respectable ladies. However, as we already know, cheap tea was often fake. The poor drank a beverage of dubious quality and origin, but even such tea gave them a feeling of warmth and comfort in their difficult lives. In addition to tea, Victorians were introduced to other colonial goods. Cocoa, coffee, spices, all of these became more accessible. The world was becoming global, and this was reflected in the contents of kitchen cupboards. This sugar-stimulating diet had a downside. The increase in sugar consumption led to the widespread prevalence of tooth decay, and replacing a full meal with sweet tea exacerbated malnutrition problems. Thus, tea and sugar did not just enter the diet, they shaped it. They made the lives of workers a little more bearable, but at the same time contributed to the emergence of new problems. And how did those who could not afford even cheap tea and bread survive? In the next chapter, we will look into the darkest place in Victorian England, the workhouse. In the Victorian era, poverty was considered not a misfortune, but a vice. Those who could not feed themselves ended up in a workhouse, in an institution with prison-like conditions. Food there was one of the tools of control and punishment, and its purpose was not to satisfy hunger, but only to sustain life. The diet in the workhouse was strictly regulated and deliberately made as meager and monotonous as possible. The authorities believed that conditions should be worse than those of the lowest paid worker. This was supposed to discourage lazy poor people from seeking help. The staple of the diet was oatmeal porridge called grail. It was cooked in water without salt, sugar, or milk. It was a gray, tasteless mass that was served for breakfast and dinner every day. Lunch usually consisted of bread and a little cheese. Sometimes, for variety, they might be given watery soup with a few pieces of vegetables. Meat was practically absent from the diet. It was given in the form of broth once or twice a week. All portions were strictly measured. Any deviation from the norm was punished. It was believed that even an extra spoonful of porridge could corrupt a poor man and discourage him from working. Such a diet was designed to barely sustain physical existence. It lacked the necessary vitamins and minerals. Prolonged exposure to such a diet led to exhaustion and disease. It was especially hard for women, who often ended up in workhouses. They were forced to do hard labor, for example, in the laundry, while receiving the same meager food. This undermined their already poor health. The workhouse system was a symbol of the cruelty of Victorian society. It demonstrated a complete lack of compassion for those who had fallen to the bottom of society. In this context, food ceased to be a source of life and became an instrument of oppression. Despite its harshness, For some, it was the only way to avoid starvation. Being sent to a workhouse meant losing one's freedom and human dignity. But the only alternative was the street. The history of the workhouse diet is an extreme manifestation of the social injustice of that era. It shows that food can be not only a pleasure or a necessity, but also a weapon in the hands of the state. In a world without electric refrigerators, preserving food was a real art and a daily necessity. A Victorian housewife had to master a variety of techniques to keep her supplies from spoiling. Her skills determined whether her family would have food in the winter. The most common method was salting. Meat and fish were salted in large barrels, which allowed them to be stored for months. Salted meat was the staple diet during long sea voyages and in winter for many families. Smoking was another effective method of preservation. Pork legs, sausages, and fish were smoked in special smokehouses or simply in the chimney. The smoke not only killed bacteria, but also gave the products a characteristic taste and aroma. Vegetables and fruits were pickled and fermented for the winter. Cabbage, cucumbers, mushrooms. All of these were harvested in large quantities. Vinegar and salt were the main preservatives available to every housewife. Wealthy homes had ice houses, special cellars where ice harvested from rivers and lakes was stored in winter. The ice house allowed perishable foods such as milk, butter, and fresh meat to be stored for several days. It was similar to a modern refrigerator. Less wealthy families used cold cellars and pantries. Food was stored in clay pots covered with a damp cloth. Each product required its own storage conditions, and the housewife had to know these subtleties. Drying was also a popular method. Fruit, mushrooms, and herbs were dried in the sun or in the oven. When dried, they could be stored for a very long time, retaining some of their nutritional properties. Berries and fruits were used to make jams and preserves. A large amount of sugar acted as a preservative. A jar of homemade jam was a real treat in the cold winter. All these processes required a huge amount of time and women's labor. In the fall, the kitchen turned into a real canning factory. Women spent hours cleaning, cutting, cooking, and canning, creating supplies for the whole year. These traditional preservation methods, honed over centuries, allowed people to survive in the absence of modern technology. They were the basis of food security for every family. With the growth of middle-class prosperity, dinner parties became an important social ritual. They were an opportunity to demonstrate one's wealth, good taste, and housekeeping skills. The success or failure of such a dinner could affect the reputation and even the career of the head of the family. The entire burden of preparation fell on the shoulders of the lady of the house. She had to plan the menu, buy the food, supervise the servants, and cook some of the dishes herself. It was a complex organizational task that required several days of preparation. Victorian dinner parties were incredibly lavish. They could consist of 8 or more courses, including soup, fish, several types of meat, game, vegetables, puddings, desserts, and fruit. The goal was not so much to feed the guests as to impress them with the abundance of food. Table setting was an art in itself. Snow-white tablecloths, silver cutlery, crystal glasses, elaborate flower arrangements, and napkins. Everything had to speak of the respectability of the host. There were strict rules of etiquette that everyone had to follow. For a middle-class woman, such a dinner was a kind of test. Guests evaluated not only the taste of the dishes, but also the cleanliness of the house, the training of the servants, and the hostess's ability to maintain polite conversation. This was enormous psychological pressure. At the same time, the hostess herself was often unable to fully enjoy the evening. She was constantly worried that everything would go smoothly, be served on time, and meet expectations. Her role was that of an invisible conductor of this complex performance. Even in wealthy families, thrift was important. After dinner, leftovers were not thrown away. They were used to prepare meals for the family and servants in the following days. following the principle of thrift. Dinner parties reflected middle-class values, the pursuit of success, respect for tradition, and the importance of outward respectability. Food here was not just sustenance, but a symbol of social status. These rituals also emphasized the gender roles of the time. The man provided the financial means for such a dinner, and the woman, with her labor and talent, turned that money into a successful social event. It was at these dinners that the aforementioned mock soups and other dishes imitating aristocratic cuisine were served. It was a stage on which the drama of Victorian society's social ambitions was played out. The Victorian era, with all its contrasts and contradictions, laid the foundations for modern food culture. Many of the foods, habits, and problems we face today have their roots in that period. We still live with the legacy of the Victorian plate. It was then that the industrialization of food production took place. The first canned foods, factory-made jams, and cookies appeared. Foods ceased to be exclusively homemade and became a factory-produced commodity. This era gave rise to a culture of consumption and branding. Manufacturers began to give their products names and package them in recognizable containers. Food advertising became a powerful tool for influencing consumers. The fight against mass food adulteration in the 19th century led to the creation of the first quality control laws. The idea that the state should protect consumers from unscrupulous manufacturers was born at that time. The entire modern food safety system is based on this foundation. The Victorians also gave us many culinary traditions. The traditional English Christmas menu of turkey and pudding was established at that time, and the culture of tea drinking became the hallmark of the nation. At the same time, the high-sugar, low-vitamin diet typical of the poor gave rise to health problems that are still relevant today. Debates about proper nutrition and the dangers of processed food did not begin yesterday. The role of women as the main person responsible for feeding the family is also largely a legacy of that era. Although women today have many more rights and opportunities, social expectations still place this mission on them. Street food has turned into a global fast food industry. The principles of speed, cheapness, and accessibility developed on the streets of Victorian London form the basis of the business models of modern corporations. Studying the diet of the Victorians is not just a historical excursion. It is an opportunity to understand where our current habits come from and how the food system we live in today was formed. Thus, when we look at the plate of a 19th century person, we see not only their meager or abundant dinner, we see a reflection of the social processes, technological revolutions, and human dramas that have shaped our modern world. We have taken a journey through the kitchens of the Victorian era, from the luxurious tables of the aristocracy to the meager rations of the workhouses. We saw that food was not just sustenance, but a marker of social status, a field for fraud, and an arena for the daily struggle for survival. Behind every plate was a story, most often a story of hard female labor and incredible ingenuity. The struggle for clean food, the birth of consumer culture, and the formation of our current culinary habits all began then. The Victorian era left us not only with great literature and architecture, but also with many questions about social justice and quality of life that are still relevant today. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new fascinating explorations of the past.